We're going to go ahead and get started. We have welcome, first of all, to Employment First Topics and Tactics. I love this series. It's, we're trying to talk about the importance of employment services and getting the work, talking about specific topics that relate to employment and hiring people with disabilities. And today, this is a monthly series that equips employment professionals, parents, partners, participants, I call those the 4 Ps, with tools and strategies that enhance employment first principles, which is the expectation that everyone can work with the right supports. And just a few reminders, live captioning is available, and to access the live captions, please click on the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. And we also have live ASL interpretations. And thank you so much to the University of Arizona Disability Resource Center for their services. As a reminder to our presenters and attendees, and probably more so to myself, please avoid speaking too quickly so that the captioner and the interpreters can accurately capture what's being said. Also, if you are with a family and community medicine and are eligible to receive DEI credit, we will be posting in the chat the link to register for that, and then again at the end we'll post that link and put up a slide with the QR code. So if you're here from the university for DEI credit, that will be posted throughout the webinar. So today's topic is amplifying employment through tribal vocational rehabilitation. I visit a lot of providers throughout the state, and one of the things I've recognized is that many people, there's confusion around, tribal VR, their role, how we can blend those or braid those with state VR, and really to how to utilize that service and to understand that. So that's one of the reasons why I picked it for Employment First Topics and Tactics. It's what I was hearing from parents that they needed and from professionals. So throughout with today's session, we encourage you to ask questions. You can put those in the chat. We can, Wayne's pretty casual, so we can have those conversations as we go. We have some questions that we're going to kind of get going and ask about, but we will also have a dedicated question and answer at the end. But we want this to kind of be a conversation so that you guys are getting the questions answered that you need for the work that you're doing. So first I want to introduce Wayne Daigle. Wayne serves as the director of AVERTAC Project. He's the new director of AVERTAC Project. Mr. Daigle is a first generation descendant of the Rumsa family of the Blackfeet tribe, has over 20 years of experience in the vocational rehabilitation world. Mr. Daigle began his career as a client of vocational rehabilitation in 1996. I love that. After being involved in a motor vehicle accident that resulted in a spinal cord injury. He has served twice as an interim AVERS project director for Northern Cheyenne VR program in Montana, and he's also worked as a VR counselor for the state of Montana for 8 years. In addition to serving as technical assistance consultant and trainer to the AVER Circle, continuous improvement of rehabilitation counselors, leaders, and educators, Mr. Daigle has developed, managed, and implemented many disability and employment-focused programs, including a workforce program funded under WIOA. So we really appreciate you being here, Wayne. I'm going to have you introduce any of your tribal partners that you have here, and then we'll get going.
Yeah, thank you. So that introduction, really, I don't like hearing it, but thank you. I don't like having that much light showing on me. So thank you for sharing that, though. Today we have Earlson Peacock joining us, and Earlson is our community program coordinator with AVERTAC. AVERTAC is the American Indian Vocational Wow. I don't know what happened there. I'm not sure. My brain just shut off. The American Indian Vocational Rehabilitation Training and Technical Assistance Center.
It's one of those big ones, one of those big acronyms, isn't it?
Yeah, when you got to stop and take a breath in the middle of your name, you're working for the feds. Your grant-funded project. Anyway, so AVERTAC is what we refer to the name because it's easier to say and it's short. And we are the only technical assistance center for all of the tribal VR programs across 26 states. There's 93 projects that we serve. Today we have a couple projects being represented. We have Ms. Paula Sinez with Navajo Nation. I'll let her introduce herself. And we also have Ms. Gail Pahona with Hopi Tribe. So Paula, can you do a quick brief introduction?
Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad to see that you have joined our session. She'eya Policines Dinishya, Kinthachit Ninishla, Twoheglini Bashichin, Hanangaki Dashiche, Ashin Dashanella, Akut Egel, Astanishla. I just introduced myself with my kinship from the Navajo Nation. We acknowledge our parents' clan as well as our grandparents' clan because we do come from a long lineage of strong people. We are a matrilineal society, and so I acknowledge myself as a Diné woman. I'm the director of the Navajo Nation's Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation Services. Our administrative office is in Window Rock, Arizona. However, we serve in the states of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, the Navajo Nation, and Colorado, and the Navajo Nation extends into those state geographical areas. We were the first vocational rehabilitation program funded under the Rehabilitation Act, and Wayne will share a little bit more about the history of American Indian vocational rehab service programs. We do provide vocational rehabilitation. We also provide independent living services that's funded by the Navajo Nation Council. And we also have some other federal grants working with children with disabilities and home visiting programs. But I'll stop there and turn it back to Wayne. Welcome.
Thanks, Paula. Gail? Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sorry, this is Gail Pahona from the Hopi Tribe, and I am the manager for Voc Rehab. I just started recently, so kind of catching up on things that need to happen. So I'm going through most of the trainings right now, or just to catch up with everyone else out there. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Gail.
Thank you, Gail, for being here. I think Paula does a great transition. Wayne, do you mind sharing like the history, a little bit of AVERTAC and kind of how that came to be?
Yeah, I'll talk about the history of AVERS, the American Indian VR Services projects. So what happened was we found that the states weren't fully able to serve our people in an appropriate way for a couple reasons. One is the remoteness and length of travel to a lot of our reservation lands, and two, the cultural impact or the cultural appropriateness in the service provision wasn't acknowledged. And if we look at CFR and the language, it's not allowed as a service under the state side, but that is the cornerstone of what separates AVERS projects from the state VR system, is that we can provide culturally appropriate and responsive services to our individuals with disabilities. This started in the early 70s as a grant between Arizona State and Navajo Nation, and it evolved. It started out as a 3-year grant, and then it turned into a 5-year grant, and that was funded under the RSA, Rehab Services Administration. And it was moved under section, it started out in section 131, moved to section 121 in the Rehab Act. And that founded the funding source for these AVERS projects. So in the 75, I believe, the first 5-year grant was developed, and that was with Navajo Nation. So as Paula said earlier, the Navajo Nation was the first project to be funded, and this year we get to celebrate 50 years with Navajo Nation, so that's a great achievement. From there, it expanded until we have 93 projects now. So every year, every grant cycle, it's a 5-year grant cycle, you get to apply for funding, and that's housed through RSA, Department of Ed, RSA, and any tribe can apply for that funding to get a AVERS project.
Okay, thanks, Wayne. And I think you bring up a really good thing, which I think leads into one of our questions, which is you specifically talked about the cultural relevancy. And so I'm kind of curious, how do TVR programs integrate cultural values and traditions into the employment process for Native American job seekers? Like when you said you saw that need, and so what did that look like, and how does that look like compared to maybe other services? And Gail and Paula, we'd love for you, to join in on, maybe how you guys do that as well within your organizations.
Wayne, before we respond to that question, I just want to also add to Wayne's comments is that that there are tribes within Arizona that collaborate with the Sonoran Center that Lori is currently employed with, the Navajo Nation, which is in the northern part of Arizona, the Hopi tribe, which is also part of the up in the northern part of Arizona, the White Mountain Apache tribe, which is located near Sholo, Arizona, Fort Mojave, and they also extend into California and Arizona, as well as Nevada, I believe. So Fort Mojave tribe and Tohono O'odham Nation, sometimes they're referred to as TO, and they are located in southern Arizona, not too far from Tucson. Well, actually, Sells, Arizona is about an hour and a half from Tucson, but they also have lands in various parts of southern Arizona. And the last tribe funded in Arizona is the Salt River or Pima Maricopa Indian communities. There are approximately 574 federally recognized tribes. So obviously you see that these tribes would have their own unique languages, their own traditions and cultures. So our grants are also 5-year competitive grants. We compete against one another. It's not like the state plan where we submit a state plan and we're funded on population. No, the federal government has us competing with one another based on competitive grant application. As Wayne mentioned, those grant applications, if you are successful, you are funded for a 5-year period. And so you can kind of see some of the challenges that we have in having to compete for our vocational rehab services in our community. And I just want to go back to each of the tribes are very unique in how they provide employment services in their communities. In our grant applications, we do have a needs assessment or a needs section of the grant. So that's where we would write out a lot of our sections of our employment strategies. Salt River Pima Maricopa is located in the Scottsdale, Maricopa County, Phoenix area. And so you'll see that they have a lot of resources to employment options within their communities. Navajo Nation and the Hopi tribe are located in very remote locations of northern Arizona. And so our employment options, we have to be creative. So in providing culturally appropriate services, of course, we offer the services within our communities with our Navajo Nation language. Hopi does the same. Our staff do speak the Navajo language and can provide those services, whether it's job support types of services in the Navajo language. Secondly, we do employ individuals. Our staff are from their communities. So if you look at a map of the Navajo Nation, it's very vast. And so, for instance, in Tuba City, Arizona, we have staff hired from those communities, and they know their communities. They know the resources in their communities. They develop those employment resources and connections in the community. As I mentioned, my clans and my kinship earlier, it's all about relationships, developing those relationships with applicants that apply for services and relationships with the business community or community members throughout the Navajo Nation and community members. We usually do a activity where we, if we're going to target the employment community, and I think I shared this with you, Lori, so you can help me with this, but where we did if we're targeting the employment community, for instance, in Tuba City, we look at who the county commissioners are, who the tribal officials are, who the, we have chapter government, so who the chapter officials are. And we work with our staff to find out what relationships do they have with those community members. And so it may be informal type of relationship when they develop and cultivate those relationships. And then we also do a lot of self-employment opportunities for our applicants and our clients that we serve. We have individuals that are very talented and skilled. And so University of Montana developed a self-employment toolkit, and we can put the website in the chat, but that's a toolkit that was established and developed for tribal VR communities and staff and clients. And so you might want to just add on, Lori, to what we talked about in terms of developing those relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. One of the things that we've really, I mean, within employment itself, relationships are super important. And I think that's one thing that gets a little lost when we provide services is we're more about the forms than the relationship. And specifically in tribal communities, Paul and I had a really long conversation about this, but it's even more so in tribal communities, that it's about the relationships that you build. It's about the networks and whose cousin works where, and again, reaching out to the community within the community of people of where the tribal communities are. And so having that and recognizing that part of supported employment or customized employment or employment services is even amplified when we serve tribal communities even more. So
I don't know if you want to hand it back to Wayne or Gail. Go ahead, Wayne.
Gail, did you want to add anything about the cultural services you guys provide?
Well, with the Hopi tribe, we're always following the tribal government's philosophy, which is working in the spirit of Sumit Nangwa. What that means to come together to do things for the benefit of all, out of compelling desire and commitment to contribute or return something of value to the society. And the other one is Namit Nangwa, means to help one another or give aid in times of need without having to be asked to do so and without expecting compensation for the deed. So that's the Hopi tribe's philosophy. So we have to incorporate all that into our program management. And a lot of it comes from, our culture, like just like Ms. Sina said, we know each other's, our Hopi individuals that we hire are Hopi and they can speak the language. So that really helps to understand or to give aid to our individuals that are coming in.
All right, thanks, Gail.
Mhm.
So one of the things that we at AVERTAC, we're charged with creating a definition for culturally appropriate services. And I want to share that with you. So in the provision of education, guidance, technical assistance, and capacity building to address the essential needs of the AVERS projects, AVERTAC will recognize and respect each tribe's unique history, sovereignty, oral tradition, oral traditional knowledge, spirituality, languages, beliefs, values, livelihoods, ceremonies, and perspectives about tribal members with disabilities. Now, this definition is very important, and I can throw it in the chat box, because when we start talking about serving people, it's very important to recognize that over 500 languages don't have a word for disability. Our native language does not capture or have a word for disability. So in our systems and in our beliefs, we don't see a disability as an issue. It's a natural occurring event, and we describe it as as part of that individual. So a person with an amputation becomes the person without a leg or a missing leg. Somebody that struggles learning, maybe it's just the person who learns differently, is how we would describe that in our languages. So it's really important that we recognize that piece, because then our ceremonies also build upon helping that individual with those barriers to employment. Or at this point, it'd be barriers to life, not just employment. And our whole concept of familial and group acceptance is really important. Like Paula said, it's all about the relationship and connection to our community and our people. And part of what AVERTAC is really trying to do with a lot of the states we're working with is help develop that relationship between state VR and tribal VR, but also the CRPs or subcontractors of state VR. Because out in our service area, we don't have a lot of those services available. Our budgets are really small compared to state VR budgets. Our average right now is right around 500,000 a year. That's salary and then all consumer or client services, education services. So when we start looking at having the ability to support job placement, it's almost not possible with some of our budgets. And another thing is when we look at staffing purposes within those tribal VR programs, we see in a lot of cases, we have a project director, we have a TVR counselor, we might have an administrative person who does the intake or phone answering. And then in some offices, that's all there is, 3 people that are doing all this work. In other offices, we might see, a project director, a couple VR counselors, maybe an employment specialist, maybe a VR tech or a TVR tech. So when we see this disparity between staffing, funding, you can start to get a picture of why we're trying to establish these connections and relationships with our partners as we move our people towards employment. Now, employment first concept isn't new to us in the tribal communities, because as a society, everybody has a role. Men have a role, women have a role, children have a role, and the expectation is whether you have a disability or not, you fulfill your role to the best of your ability. And that's back from our old societal structures. Modern times, things have changed a little bit and we don't have that same need, but our subsistence lifestyle was our work lifestyle. We lived every day through our dedication to subsistence living, employment. Okay, so that's native employment. So employment first is not a new concept to our people. Everybody was expected to work. Everybody has the opportunity to participate in that role. And now through Tribal VR, we are able to capture that and really support it. It's an interesting concept because the state system came up with supported employment and customized employment, where we have the discovery and all these different pieces. And that's a new training that's taken place. But in our Tribal VR systems, we already do that. We do the customized employment. We get to know our people. We spend probably 2 times longer getting to know our individual consumers than a state office does in their intake. We bring in the family. We have family. We do group services. We do family services to that individual's family in the development and support of that individual to go to work. Our natural supports a lot of times are our family members, because there is no support system in our rural settings. Paul had brought up that there's, like Salt River Pima has great access to employment supports. When you're out in Tuba City, or pick a place on First Mesa with on the Hopi Res. Some of the roads are still gravel roads. There's not a lot of infrastructure out there in those remote areas. So we have to turn to our family and friends. And I think, Lori, I'm sorry I got way off topic there.
No, we appreciate it, but I think it's really good, because I think you brought up some of the challenges, and I would really love to expand on that, especially as employment support professionals here. Like when we talk, when we think about what are the strengths of the communities we're serving, we heard, for the tribal communities, the community, centric approach, family, and culturally, the culture is important to them. So I guess it kind of leads into a question I think that many probably people here on the call have, which is, how can we do a better job? Meaning, how can people who are providing services in regards to state, and also kind of that relationship, I'd love to clarify the relationship between state VR and tribal VR, and how do those work together? And even if we want to take like a job seeker and kind of walk through it, let's start with that. How can we do better, and what is the relationship between state VR and tribal VR?
But go ahead, Paula.
Lori, can you put up the Navajo Nation model on the website? Because I think it really relates to some of this, and I'll just talk us through briefly, and then maybe Gail, she can put up the Hopi model, which I also put in the chat. I just want to share that the Navajo Tribal VR programs, as I mentioned earlier, have their own unique ways of models for providing vocational rehabilitation services. I used to work for the state of New Mexico with DVR prior to returning home to run our vocational rehab program. And I know their program is very linear in structure, where you begin with services and then you have an outcome at the end. What we have here is the Navajo Nation's model for providing vocational rehabilitation services. And the heart of our teachings, one of our teachings is the Navajo basket. and it's not just used for weddings, but it's represents basically life. And as Wayne mentioned earlier, that the VR process and disability, how we approach disability, it's a way of life in our approach to vocational rehabilitation, our community in our communities. And we explain this as we go through the VR process with our applicants. So it starts with 4 quadrants. These colors also represent our sacred colors. We are not just about a physical disability or a mental disability. We approach vocational rehabilitation from a holistic model. So the Navajo basket is facing east, so we begin from the eastern direction. The color obviously is white, and it's a relationship-based intake. This is where we probably would describe outreach in our communities, the relationship with our communities, outreach in our with our partner agencies, that includes the states. And this whole part of it is the thinking portion of our process, and then so we're working with consumers and applicants on this relationship-based application. If they don't want to continue with voc rehab, we do a warm handoff to other agencies. So you kind of see that model going. We don't just start with OO referral, O2 application, and so on and so forth. Going down to the southern direction, again, we go clockwise. And so we determine eligibility and IPE at that point. This represents the planning portion of working with consumers and applicants. It represents the physical part of our being. Nahata is the planning part of the process. And again, we're talking with individuals about what their interests are, what their priorities are, what they're going to give back to the community. So we're thinking about this all along. As Gail mentioned, they may go into self-employment, and they're giving back to the community in some ways, again, following that same philosophy. Looking at program of services is the Western direction, and we see this as the emotional piece of our being, and it's the implementation. So it's the provision of services, if you would equate it to voc rehab. And then going into resilience to the north, Sihasin. This is where individuals are placed in employment, they are supported in their employment process. And that should say really work and interdependence, because while they're independent, they are interdependent within their community, their home, their family, and their entire environment. So this process makes more sense to our community members. It's explained in a way of life. It's not a religion, it's a way of life. And so I just wanted to share that with you because again, it's very important for each tribal community to work on a process that makes sense for their communities. I don't know if Gail, if you want to share a little bit about the Hopi process, but I also put that in the chat.
I'll put it up here.
Okay.
And with the Hopi process, Gail's going to be sharing about their planting. Corn is very sacred to a lot of our indigenous communities. We use it for food, we use it for prayer, we use it in our daily life. And so Hopis do dry farming. And so they established a VR process that shows the planting cycles. And you can just briefly share your program, Gail.
Okay. The model of the Hopi voc rehab program is utilizing the metaphor of corn, of each participant being a corn and taking care of our children so that the cycle ends with the individuals obtaining employment. or the corn blooms to full maturity. So this is our cycle for VR. We have planting that's not wanta, nurturing, pastinat yalta, growth, wungyoma, and then harvest is hilkia. So if they get an employment, we're harvesting the corn. So this is, what we provide to our clientele, and the VR staff are knowledgeable in Hopi tradition, speak and understand the Hopi language. And they conduct these initial interviews and explain the VR process.
Thank you for that, Gail. And I think what, one of the things that we have found to be really important in the work is that people within the community are providing services for people within the community. And I think oftentimes we're taking ourselves and going out there, but really utilizing the community and the networks and people to provide employment services from their model, from what they've created. They have these beautiful processes that include their cultural aspects, and so to just really come in and learn what those are and build the relationships with people. I want to kind of move on to the next question. And again, I don't know if we talked more about, but like just how do state and tribal VR go together? Like what does that look like for people who are, have, let's just say, state VR clients right now working on finding them a job, but they're also tribal members? What does that process look like, and how should it look? Let's do that. What's the best practice of it?
So within the state and tribal VR system, they can have a shared case. And what we look at is you run two, each group has a case. So you can develop an IPE for tribal VR systems, and you can develop the IPE for state systems. The thing is that we have to have communication between the two, so that we aren't duplicating services, so we aren't double dipping, right? Because we're all coming out of the RSA pool at the end of the day. It's just that we're in separate sides of the house. So we want to make sure that we don't double dip, and so we have to communicate with the state VR counselor and the tribal VR counselor. That communication has to take place. And in the chat box, I threw in AVERTAC's guiding principles. There's 15 things that we do to ensure that we're culturally responsive and appropriate when interacting with tribes. It's a good tool to kind of just get an outline of some of the stuff that you can do coming into a tribal VR territory or service area, just to develop that relationship following those principles. But every service that the state can offer, the tribal VR systems offer. And then we got one extra that the states can't offer, and that's traditional healing. So our healing ceremonies that take place in our communities, we can utilize that as a traditional healing for our individuals to overcome barriers to employment or impediments to employment. And right now, the state systems are not allowed to provide that service. So it's only a tribal VR system that can provide that service. So when we're working together, it's very important that we develop that trust and rapport, because on our side, a lot of our participants, especially our elders on the tribal side, there's this historical mistrust that's still there that needs to be acknowledged. A lot of times, for example, down in with a United Homa Nation, if you showed up with a stack of papers, the elders would refuse to engage or interact with you, because when they were coming out and taking the offshore oil lands and the bayous, they had these stacks of papers that they just had to put an X on. In Montana, when I was a director, or when I was the tribal liaison for state VR, if I showed up in my dress uniform, you know, the white button shirt, the slacks, people would run away out of, like, if I was pulling up into the front of the house, they were running out the back door because they thought I was CPS coming to take the kids away. And once I started changing my dress and paying attention to my environment, I was able to get more acceptance. Spend some time on the reservation is another way to develop that rapport and relationship in service provision. If you come out once every 3 months, and this is why the AVERS projects were developed, is because that was the, you know, sometimes we'd see one person a year come out to these territories. And if you only come out once every 3 months or once every 6 months, you're not going to have any rapport or trust with businesses, let alone the people that we're serving. You got to become part of the community. You have to engage in the community and understand it in order to engage the employers that are on the res. A lot of the service areas have one major employer, which is the tribe.
Mm.
And if you don't understand how to, you know, do government to government relations because of the sovereignty, you're not going to get into the employment section. You just can't get through that wall because you don't understand the steps to take. So getting to know the community, that's where the Tribal VR project staff can really become beneficial, because you partner with them. They can introduce you, they can bring you in. But it really does come down to the point of what we've been talking about all along, which is the relationship and the connection and spending time in our communities.
I just want to point out, Lori, that that we have to have memorandums of agreements with the state VR agencies. So Navajo has one with Arizona, RSA, New Mexico DVR, Utah, and that's where we their budget is larger than ours. And so they provide pre-ET services, pre-employment transition services as well. And so that's where we leverage collectively our resources. Those memorandums of agreements outline how we're going to collaborate and work together, including, you know, like I mentioned, pre-employment transition services, also employment services, professional development, and any other area where we identified as a need in our grant application. So for instance, in Arizona RSA, they've funded the Sonoran Center with the funding for pre-employment transition services. And they're also, so we've worked together in providing those direct services for students with disabilities. On our budget, we do have employment specialists who we have been trying to recruit. That has been a challenge to try to recruit qualified staff in some of our positions. And so we have worked with the states to provide, again, through Arizona Sonoran Center at the University of Arizona, to provide some of those employment supports. For the pre-employment transition services, for example, they hired an individual from the Window Rock community, which is on the Navajo Nation, to work with some of the schools. So again, hiring folks from the community is definitely important. Again, we've received a lot of support from the Sonoran Center to work on some work-based learning initiatives, and as well as working on these efforts with employment first initiatives as well. And so I'll turn it back to you, Lori.
Thanks, Paula. Gail, I'm curious if you have anything that you would like to add regarding your services. And, you know, Wayne and Paula both emphasize the need for relationships and
Mhm.
utilizing people
Mhm.
within the community, and also leveraging our partnerships. Like, Paula mentioned the Sonoran Center a few times. I know Wayne and IHD, and I know you guys have partnered with IHD. And just what that looks like from, from how state VR and tribal VR can kind of work together. And I think Wayne said a really important thing, which is you can have both services. Like, and I think it's important that both do, right? You have the state. If you have a tribal member, you should be making that referral to tribal VR. Gail, your thoughts or anything else?
I just want to add that yes, working with the state VR communicating is the best, 'cause for us, if there's a native, working for the state, that is good, then we're able to work smoothly on dual enrollments, because with the tribes, we may not get things quicker, but the state can. So, that's where the communication works best for us with the state VR.
Yes, definitely. If they have a tribal liaison contact with the state,
Mhm.
that has really helped because they also have turnover. So,
Right.
in the Flagstaff office, Arizona RSA does have a tribal liaison that we can contact. And they're very consistent in working with us, having quarterly meetings or monthly meetings to maintain that communication of what's coming up. And for instance, we're trying to do a spend down of our grants. And so again, working with the states to look at how we can work together on that. And then also being on the state rehab councils. I'm on the state rehab councils for Arizona and New Mexico. And again, the purpose of the council is to advise and recommend. And so I am allowed to do reports and provide information about how tribal VR can, what are some of the needs and how we can work closer together. So if the state VR agency has an initiative that they're funding, then I'll hear about it at the state rehab council meetings, and I'll share with with the other tribal VR programs in the state of New Mexico and Arizona to make sure that we're involved in those services. So it's also about that communication and continuing to meet regarding these efforts.
Mhm.
I don't think I've seen any questions. I just want to point out in the chat we've had, but I do want to reiterate we have about 10 minutes left. I'd love for people, if they want to, go ahead and put questions in the chat. We'll try to get them to you. Wayne, what were you going to go ahead and say?
The one thing I want to point out now is the the power and difference was always kind of looking at from our side. When you're a tribal director, a lot of times it's this handout that's given. Oh, we're going to acknowledge that this project's here, but we're not really going to be a part of it. And what we see now with a lot of these MOUs coming in is that we're seeing the benefit on both. And that's the point that I really want to put across as we leave is that when we develop an MOU, it's two agencies coming together and it's identifying how we're going to support one another. It's not just what you're going to give us, right? So pre-employment transition services is a great example because we aren't allowed in AVER's in projects to provide pre-employment transition services. We can only provide transition services. So that means working age youth only, not those in front, the pre part of pre-employment. So while that's being provided, on our side, we're providing specialized training on culture that's been here since the beginning, right? So we're really helping you understand our people and a better way to serve and sometimes even a better way of thinking and viewing the world, becoming more connected with one another rather than trying to conquer one another.
Great points. I think when it comes to employment services, it goes back to kind of, and I'm going to reiterate this for people who are on here providing services. It's not through email. It is through in-person contact. It is by going to them and meeting with people within their community, finding those networks, like Paula said, like where, what are the offices, what are the chambers, and it's going there and developing genuine, authentic relationships and understanding their culture, their process, their work, their people. And oftentimes, I've done a lot of work in tribal communities. Paula, Gail, and Wayne and I have had lots of conversations about this, but we think we can do this through technology and only. And I think that that's one thing, that's a difficult thing, is to try to do and build relationships through technology only. And if we're going to do a takeaway here, it's to take the time to go and build the relationships with your tribal communities. The ones that, one of the first things I heard when I came here was, we haven't seen a provider in years. And that's a problem. We want to make sure that we're there. And even if we haven't provided a service yet, but that we're there building relationships.
And Lori, can you also talk about how we have been working with the Sonoran Center? I think we're building on the pre-employment transition work with the schools on the Navajo Nation with this employment first. So you just want to make a couple of comments?
Yeah, sure. I'll be happy to. The Sonoran Center has a project with pre-employment transition services. I believe their leadership is on here, but I'll just briefly speak, which is because, pre-eds is a great way to partner, right? Because like Wayne said, and so finding those niches, and so we've developed relationships with the school, had some pretty successful summer work program there where students were getting out and doing summer work there, and really working on, one of the things that we've seen is that we've got to kind of maybe change the model from what we've been doing maybe in the cities to ensuring that it works within the tribal communities or the rural communities. And that partnership with Navajo has allowed us to see where some of the gaps maybe are too, so that we can have those communications with what state VR for pre-eds offers versus what, being sure we're communicating with Navajo about some of the gaps and how can we fill those in, and really working with the Sonoran Centers Finds Their Way program to make sure that all services are being, it's a holistic approach. And that's the key too, is holistic approach. Bill has a question I want to get to. This says, for Wayne, the AVERTAC guiding principles, is that applicable to which tribal community?
So, actually, I was typing a note,
Okay.
but I'd rather answer it orally than typing. So, to answer that, it's each tribe is unique in its cultural and traditional ceremonies and perspectives. So these principles are just guidelines for entering into each individual or unique tribal community. So when you look at these, there has to be some homework done first. So, checking out what tribal community you're entering into, what is their cultural viewpoints, what are their traditional and ceremonial activities, getting some background on that tribe and learning about those tribes, and then following these guidelines or these principles is how it's going to be most successful. We don't have a universal cookie cutter approach to all of our tribes because it's so different. We might be next to each other, like Hopi and Navajo is a great example, right? Navajo is surrounded by, or Hopi is surrounded by the Navajo Nation. Their cultures, because they're next door neighbors, should be the same, right? They're both from Arizona. They're both from the desert areas. They should do the same things, but they're absolutely different. And you can tell by Gail and Paula smiling and chuckling that they're absolutely different. So when we approach all tribes, just because we're tribal doesn't mean we're all the same. We do have some general characteristics that run through that we all kind of can follow along with and understand. But to do this, to implement this and establish and build the relationship, you need to learn about the tribe that you're entering in with, and then you apply these steps or these guidelines to develop and help that relationship grow.
Thank you for that. And any last minute, mentions, Paula or Gail, that you guys might have?
Again, I think that we just need to remember that AVERTAC, where Wayne works, is at a university. It's the Institute for Human Development at Northern Arizona University. So he is at a university, as well as Lori. She's at the University of Arizona Sonoran Center. And so being at universities, sometimes they have their hands tied on how they can work with us. And we barely, developed a contract with Sonoran Center after some time, because it's coming from a Navajo Nation to a university. But again, these principles, I think, are the foundation for the Institute for Human Development as to how they're going to work in providing their technical assistance and how they're going to provide their training. And so I just want to again elaborate a little bit more on, this is not specific to one tribe. If you go to their website, AVERTAC website, they do use the star quilt, which is applicable to Lakota nations, as describing the VR process. So again, these principles are just the university's approach to working with tribes. I don't know if you have anything else, Gail?
No, I don't.
Well, we really thank you all for being here today. I feel like we need more time because there's so much more to talk about. But we appreciate you being here. Thank you so much.